Science,
engineering,
medicine, chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
entrepreneurship, public health, global
aeronautics, science communication.
Yes, hello again everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell. Happy New Year, by the way, as the global economy faces huge challenges with some grim times ahead for many, according to one economist on this podcast. And the festivities of Christmas have now given way to diets and rather miserable early morning visits to the gym. Did someone say Happy New Year, by the way? Well, another expert offers some calorie-busting post-Christmas advice.
You need to fill your plate up with foods that contain more dietary fibre. Things like bread, wholemeal bread, things like vegetables, things like beans and lentils. That will make people feel full for that little bit longer.
Yes, but in the future, could additives to our foods themselves actively help us lose weight? Stay with us for a fascinating insight into the functional foods of tomorrow.
The Imperial College Podcast.
Right, let's dive straight in with some news and say Happy New Year. And hello to Sam Wong here as well. How are you, Sam?
Hi, Gareth. I'm very well, thanks. Happy New Year to you too.
So, the first story we're going to talk about in this news section is about miscarriages and an insight into the causes of miscarriages, what might trigger such a thing in a pregnant woman. So tell me more, Sam.
Yeah, so these researchers are looking at the reasons why some women seem to be more vulnerable to miscarriage, and some of them have 3 or more successive miscarriages. And it seems like there are things about the biology in the uterus that makes them more prone to pregnancy loss.
And what kind of biology are we talking about specifically?
So just to explain the background, at the start of pregnancy, normally the fertilised embryo has to embed itself into the lining of the uterus, and the uterus is only receptive to embryos for a few days in each menstrual cycle. And this seems to ensure that embryos are only accepted and embedded in the uterus when they're at the right stage of development. So in the new study, they're looking at chemical signals produced by human cells taken from the lining of the uterus and grown in the lab. And they identified a molecule called IL-33, which is secreted by these cells, and it influences the activity of nearby cells and seems to be important in controlling whether the uterus can accept an embryo.
So you mentioned then IL-33. How does it behave differently in women who have already had miscarriages?
So in most women, IL-33 has its effects for a short period of time during the menstrual cycle, which helps to ensure that the womb is only receptive in that short time. But they found that in cells from women who have suffered 3 or more miscarriages, that high levels of IL-33 are still being secreted for 10 days, and that suggests that the receptivity of the uterus is not being controlled properly in these women. So interestingly, they also looked at what effect these chemical signals have in mice. If you take these chemicals produced by the human cells and you treat the uterus of mice with them, how do they influence the fertility? And they discovered that if you take chemicals produced by cells from women who've had repeated miscarriages, it extends the time period during which those mice can become pregnant, but it also makes those mice more likely to have a miscarriage. So it seems like having this prolonged window of fertility increases the risk of abnormal embryos implanting in the womb. It also is associated with inflammation in the lining of the womb, and that compromises the development of good embryos.
What can we take away from this research now that we know a bit more about the action of IL-33?
Well, it tells us about the molecular processes that control the receptivity of the womb, and that could be very useful because it suggests that we might be able to target these molecules as a strategy for developing treatments that would prevent miscarriages in women who are particularly vulnerable.
Right, well, Sam, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating research and obviously important research as well. Now, Katie Weeks is also here. Happy New Year to you as well, Katie. And I know that it will be a happy new year of many events here at Imperial. So what have we got to look forward to?
Yes, it is many events. So after quite a busy autumn term last year, where I think I learnt things ranging from how to make an invisibility cloak to how to turn sewage into fertiliser, we've got another busy term lined up for people this year, starting with some sort of inaugural lectures in January, and then the Fringe picks up again in February.
Which inaugural lectures really spring out then? I know they'll all be brilliant, but if you had to pick one?
If I had to pick one, I think given my physics background, it would have to be the Searching for Dark Matter and the Higgs Boson one in February 20th of February.
People will be reaching for their diaries on that one. Incidentally, they can look these up on imperial.ac.uk/events.
They can indeed, yeah.
What else in terms of the Imperial Fringe? Because we had 3 Fringe events last year. They all went very well attended. When do those pick back up again this term?
So the first one starts on the 21st of February, and that's actually as part of Arts Fest in the college. So there's a number of sort of art, science, collaborative projects that are doing interactive demonstrations for that one. So that would be quite interesting. And then we've got another one in March, and that's our final one before the festival, which is on the 3rd and 4th of May this year.
I gather also an opportunity to see the geneticist Steve Jones this term.
Yes, there is actually. That's in February again. I'm quite excited about that one too because my genetics and biology are not that strong, so I'm looking forward to learning a bit and being able to impress people with my biology.
Yeah, me too. I bumped into Steve Jones the other day as well.
Did you?
A bit of a name drop for you, but he was at an event that I was also at, and he actually helped me out with getting the train back home because they were all... Anyway, this is a boring story, but I saw him and he's a really nice guy. Would you like to plug maybe this here pamphlet that we have here?
Yes. Gav's holding up the nice shiny spring programme pamphlet that's around campus now, which basically lists all the events that are going on. Well, a selection of the events, because there are obviously more events than just in this programme, but it kind of gives you a taster of what's happening in the college.
I'm literally just sight reading this, but we've got cardiac surgery in the recession, the arts experiment, you've just been talking about that, Parkinson's disease, a car crash in the brain. I mean, that's just a few that I've randomly picked out. So people should look out for this pamphlet and then have their diaries, or as we say these days, their Google or Outlook calendars ready.
Yes, they should.
Splendid. Katie, thank you very much indeed for that. And speaking of the Fringe, later on in this podcast, we're going to be revisiting the Fringe that took place in December. More on that coming up. Well, now let's do some future gazing. That is exactly what Andrew Chizevsky has been doing. He's editor of Reporter magazine. And Andrew, you've really kicked off the new year with a feature where a number of experts from around Imperial College have been given their predictions about what they think is going to be big, what's going to be important in the worlds of science, innovation and medicine in the months and indeed years ahead. So tell me more.
That's right, yeah. So, I mean, I'm fairly new to Imperial, and for me as a science journalist, it was almost like a kid in a sweet shop.
But let's just walk through a few of the ideas and a few of the experts. One of them was a physicist then.
That's right, Professor Stephen Schwartz from physics. Now, I mean, it's one of my favourite topics. It just makes me feel like a schoolboy again, sort of thinking about space missions and things like that. We had the shuttle retiring last year. Stephen made the point that you don't need a shuttle really to do missions. We've got sort of Cassini, which is exploring Saturn. We've got the Mars rover and lots of interesting other missions planned, manned from Earth, so that's arguably the sort of future there, I think.
OK, well, let's hear a little bit of Stephen now speaking to you with his thoughts on the future of space missions.
I think by and large, science will be done by unmanned activities. There hasn't been a lot of great science that's been done by the manned activities. It's just hard to do. It's a really harsh environment. Getting to Mars, putting a person on the surface of Mars is incredibly difficult. And getting them there and getting them back alive is all but impossible, at least by today's standards, just because of radiation hazards and other things. One day we will do it. When you do the one-way trip, which is easier to do, that there'll be people queuing up to go and live out the rest of their lives on Mars. But that's expensive and some way off.
That's Stephen Schwartz there. So, Andrew, what else was said, for instance, about the commercialisation of space? Because I always get the impression that is a trend and it's something we're going to see and hear a load more of in the coming months and years.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something we discussed as well. I mean, going back to my kind of boyhood fascinations, we've got Virgin Galactic supposed to be going live this year. And if you've got a spare £250,000, then you can go to the edge of space. That'll be its continued theme. I mean, it's probably going to be another 50 years before price comes down, but yeah, it's sort of really exciting.
OK, so that's if you have a spare £250,000, but people with that much cash in their back pockets are increasingly rare. Very grim times for many around the economy and what's going on in industry and commerce, which leads us nicely on to economics and another of the experts that you have in your feature. So tell me more.
Yeah, Professor Jonathan Haskell at the business school. Now, I chose him because he's quite a broad economist, looks at macroeconomics, which is basically how countries relate to each other on the economic level. And yeah, he was extremely candid about various topics, which is, can be quite unusual for people in his position, but for me it was just incredibly enlightening for that, and I think it made for a really interesting interview.
he doesn't hold back. He was particularly outspoken about these big infrastructure projects, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the sort of key issues for the country going forward with things like, high-speed rail and a new airport in the southeast and new nuclear power stations. But, he put the brakes on that quite swiftly and I think quite elegantly made the point about the biggest infrastructure being housing, basically, which affects pretty much every one of us.
No, sure, because you put it to him, well, the great thing about these big infrastructure projects like HS2, they generate jobs, that could all be part of growth. Not necessarily so, says Jonathan.
These are all, in the French, grand projet, trophy projects, which ministers can get themselves onto the telly by opening. So, unfortunately, the whole infrastructure debate is all skewed towards all of those. There is one enormous, great, huge, stonking infrastructure project which we could do in a minute, which would be incredibly helpful for growth, and that's build more houses. But there's no political will to do it. Opening number 47th Avenue is not going to get the minister on telly, whereas opening the London to Birmingham HS2 at the cost of billions and billions and billions will do.
Right, yeah, so I think we get the sense, the vague sense of what Jonathan means, putting his point pretty strongly there. One would also think that we hark back to, the 1950s and the days of manufacturing. That's when people say, the British economy was at its strongest. Is Jonathan one for looking back in anger or in nostalgia, as it were?
Absolutely not, no. I mean, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about rebalancing the economy in favour of manufacturing, in this renaissance in manufacturing, and maybe that's happening, but actually some of the creative industries, we're not making anything as such here, but these are creative services industries and we should be celebrated for sort of being successful in them, basically.
He's very fond of citing the Rolling Stones and Harry Potter as those big ticket creative forces that really put Britain on the map. He seems to be making the point that they generate wealth, but I suppose there are limitations even to those upsides.
We're terribly good at these various things like Harry Potter and all that kind of thing, but actually those are things which don't really involve kind of mass production in the way that making aeroplanes and cars and cameras and that kind of thing. They really involve kind of the inspired, innovation of one person. So then you might have an economy where you've got people who are good at things, but because it's a kind of a winner-take-all situation, there's only one Harry Potter, if you see what I mean. Then you have a very kind of unequal economy. The Harry Potters and the Rolling Stones of this world, get very, very rich, and because there aren't production lines anymore, there's nothing for anybody else to do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Except maybe serve these people drinks in nightclubs, or work at the O2 Centre, doing tickets and all that kind of thing. So then you have a very different kind of economy to a 1950s economy, where you didn't have any of that, but you just had lots of people working in fairly safe and secure routine jobs, if you see what I mean. That economy obviously is going to look very different to the kind of thing we had in the 50s, which may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing, depending on where you stand.
And of course, Andrew, the whole idea of corporate tax ended up being hugely topical at the end of 2012, and it still is. I'm sure that must have been part of your conversation as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was very prescient from Jonathan. I put to him the issue, which was people like Starbucks, basically not paying their tax. And it's kind of an issue that most people agree on. You won't find many people saying, Starbucks should pay less tax. But he actually said, well, this is in the nature of globalisation, basically.
He would say it's pointless even trying to tax a lot of these businesses because they're so globalised.
Exactly. And in fact, he said the only way they might pay tax is if public opinion was so strong that they had to appease public opinion. Very prescient, because that actually did happen with Starbucks. They did pay what some would call a token amount of tax, but they did pay in the end.
Absolutely. So talk there about the economy and physics. I mean, just briefly, you covered two other topics in the feature as well, didn't you?
Yes, I did, yeah. So there was medicine as well. Professor Dame Julia Polak, a very interesting character herself, who was actually undergone some major transplantations herself, which is the area she works in. But she's also working on stem cell therapy and actually regrowing organs from your own stem cells, which many see as a sort of elixir in medicine, basically. So
right, and climate change as well is another topic.
Yeah. I mean, as I've said in the feature, arguably the one which has potentially the greatest impact of everything that I discussed in the feature, because it's where we live. And if the climate is derailed, then it'll have an effect on every aspect of our lives, basically.
Right, so we've given you a flavour on this podcast, but if you haven't read it yet, I really urge you to read that feature. I genuinely enjoyed it, Andrew, and it's sort of helped me get my brain back in gear after the Christmas break, reading that right at the beginning of January. Come back at the end of the year and see how many of the predictions come true.
Yeah, that would be interesting, yeah. Watch this space.
Thanks for coming in. Andrew Chizewski there. Well, finally, to the Imperial Festival. And like any good festival, it has its own fringe. In our case, a series of events related to the main festival that take place during the year. Our third fringe was in December, just before Christmas, and given the season, it could only really have had one theme. Food, of course. There was carbon dioxide sorbet and cheese used to measure the speed of light with the aid of that most important of high-tech lab technology, the microwave oven. Kerry Noble was there, where she heard about the future of food and some additives that could do some very interesting things in the future.
I'm here at the December Fringe with Professor Gary Frost. The theme's food and drink. It's January by the time we're listening to this, but your research might be relevant because you're talking about appetite control. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, what we're interested in is the relationship between the food that we eat and how the gut signals about what we've eaten to make us feel full after that meal. And if we can understand that in a little bit more detail, we might be able to use some of the signals generated from food to help regulate our appetites a little bit better.
So when you talk about signals, can you tell us a little bit more about what that means inside the body?
Yeah, so the signals that we're interested in are hormones that are released. Our gut releases hundreds of hormones when we eat, and we understand that some of them are related to appetite regulation. So in the stomach, for example, there's a hormone called ghrelin that when we feel hungry is high. Further down in your intestines, there are hormones that make you feel less hungry, hormones that are called PYY and GLP-1, and they're of particular interest to our research group.
And what's the use of this research in medical terms?
In medical terms, what we hope by understanding the way that food releases these hormones, we can change perhaps the food that we eat to actually make these signals last a bit longer, so we eat a little bit less, and therefore we're able to control our appetite and our body weight a little bit better over time.
How would that research be used? How could that actually be used in the treatment of people?
Well, you can use it in two ways. You could say, well, if we have that understanding, can we actually help people who are overweight lose weight? The angle that we're coming from more is, can we actually prevent people gaining weight in the first place? So adults over their lifetime gain a certain amount of weight, some more than others. If we can actually understand that, can we change food a little bit to actually prevent that weight gain?
How would your research translate into that? What sort of medicines would you be looking at?
We want to actually change things that are in the food chain, so it can be applied widely. Obesity is a problem that affects over 60% of the population. So therefore, if you're going to treat it, you need something that we can use in a wide proportion of the population. So what we're looking at is foods that are very, very safe, that we can actually add into things that are commonly eaten, such as bread, that will make people feel full for that little bit longer.
So these are actual sort of functional foods that we would eat but that would in some way benefit our health?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a good description of functional food or a functional ingredient. Or another way that we're looking at it is, can we understand the structure of certain foods, and can we actually, if we keep that structure of the food, could that actually relate to an appetite signal?
So the thing I'm wondering is the food industry going to be interested in producing products that people are going to eat less of instead of products that people are going to eat more of?
That's a very interesting question, and I think the landscape's changed over the last few years, and undoubtedly the food industry are interested in actually producing food that will help appetite regulation. And the way that I think you can justify it, because as you quite rightly said, it doesn't make sense. Why would you do something that you eat more? But I think you can actually charge a premium for the product. So the bread that has an appetite roll, you'd probably pay a few pence more than the bread that doesn't have that roll.
So by the time the listeners hear this, they might be thinking, after the festive season, it's time to lose a pound or two. Is there anything that your research tells us about, in practical terms, what people should be doing more or less of to keep their weight down?
Well, the bit that we're really excited about is the actual components of food that we don't actually absorb, that get into our colon. And we believe that the way that those components of food are handled produce a strong appetite signal. So if you actually eat a lot of dietary fibre, then we think that that makes you feel full for longer. So you need to fill your plate up with foods that contain more dietary fibre.
And what sort of foods should we be looking at?
Well, there are a variety of things like bread, wholemeal bread, things like vegetables, things like beans and lentils, that will make people feel full for that little bit longer.
Great, thank you very much indeed.
Well, that report from the December Fringe was from Kerry Noble. She was speaking there to Gary Frost. Well, that's it for this edition. Of course, there is plenty of video and indeed audio available for you. One place to look is our YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com/Imperial College Video. If you want to stay in touch with us via Twitter, we are at Imperial Spark. And to be across all the latest news and events from Imperial, just go to imperial.ac.uk/news. Well, thank you very much for your company in this edition. I'm Gareth Mitchell, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.